The only thing I can say that if you listen to that and were thinking about your problems, listen again. When you hear music like that coming from the depths of our soul, all seeming problems disappear. And our challenge is to stay in that space when we're going through our stuff. Thank you so for Rayford. Yes, and the Motowners, the choir. Oh, thank you so much. It's always an absolute pleasure to be back at Unity on the Bay. As I always say that whenever here with your folks, it's like I never left. I can feel and sense that connection. So thank you for coming out this morning. It's my pleasure to be here. As I was saying, I was down here. I said, well, let me come down and celebrate my birthday. My birthday was yesterday. And I said, I can't imagine a better place to be than Unity on the Bay. You know, many years ago when I was a young child, many years ago, still young at heart, but anyway, I came home from school, and I could sense that something wasn't quite right. I was around 6 years old, and it was a terrifying experience that I had gone through, at least from my view at that time. Because I'd come home, and my mother was not there, and she was always there. It was around 3 o'clock or so when I got from school there, and she wasn't there, and then, at 4 o'clock she didn't arrive, and 5 o'clock, and 6 o'clock, and a sense of angst started coming over me. And I forgot about it for a moment, and went to bed that night, and got up the next morning, and she still was not there. So a sense of dread increased in me. And I had a lot of stuff going on in the family, so I didn't know what had happened to her. I didn't know whether she was alive or had left, was not coming back. And, that night turned into a week, and that week turned into months. And I didn't see her again. And, of course, it had an impact on me that set a trajectory of my life that I didn't really understand the depths of it till many years later. But I know that I had a void within me as a result of that. And I sought to fill that void by channeling my energy and doing well in school. That somehow I thought that if I did that, that somehow, some way, that void would be filled. So I did well in school, went to an Ivy League college, went to law school, thinking that, having overcome the challenges of my neighborhood, the impoverishment that we experienced, that this would give me a sense of satisfaction. This would fill that void, that emptiness that I had within me. But of course, it never happened. Because anytime you try to fill something outside of you for something that's missing within you, what follows that temporary satisfaction is dissatisfaction. And so later on in my life, I got involved in riotous living. This was around the 80s in Miami, and as I was mentioning in the earlier service, that this was the time that a lot of riotous living was going on. If you know, you know. And ended up losing everything that I thought was important in my life during that time. And I was trapped in a prison of my own making, a prison that was in my own mind. And of course, I later tried to fulfill that through other external stuff, but those things can only address the surface effects and not the root problem. I think there have to be changes at the root level. There must be a transformation of the soul. We have different definitions of what that is, but in New Thought, Ancient Wisdom teachings of which we are a part, the soul is really the equal of our entire awareness that is within us, our thoughts and feelings. It is our consciousness. And it's behind everything that we see or express in our life and in our world. And we nurture our soul with the thoughts and values that we feed it. And those thoughts and values either come from the human way of seeing the world, the three-dimensional world, what comes to us through the television sets and the iPhones, and oftentimes it's the shadow side of humanity, the lower vibration. Or those things, they come from the divine and the perfect, pure spiritual ideas of spirit. So if we feed our souls with fear, thoughts, and the beliefs of separation, what will manifest in a world is a world of divisiveness and behavior that reflects the us versus them consciousness. But when we feed our soul with principles of truth, the high ideas and ideals and the purity of spirit, that is what shows up in our life. So one source contaminates the consciousness and the other maintains its purity. So we hear the master teacher, Jesus the Christ, saying in Mark 8:36 that for those who have ears to hear, he said, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Now understand, this energy of the soul, consciousness, is not limited by time. It's not limited by space. This came to me as I was thinking about what I recall hearing about Dr. Howard Washington Thurman, who was a theologian, a mystic, and he was a mentor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And in the 1970s, he gave a lecture, and it was so interesting, entitled "The Benefits of Slavery." Now, I asked him, I called up Boston University Library one time. I said, can I get that speech? Because I need to read that. And they said, I don't think he said anything like that. But I knew he had said it because I had talked to a couple of my high school classmates, and we were all together, on spring break, I think, or winter break down in Miami. And one of my friends had gone to Morehouse College where they had that lecture. And we were all home for the holidays and doing nefarious things, telling lies. But anyway, one of my classmates told me about that, and I asked him, well, what are they teaching you there? But then he went on to explain what he meant. He went on to say that Dr. Thurman focused on the mindset of the African people. And they had a creative essence that developed due to their close relationship with nature. And they had that close relationship with the Spirit of the living God, or what we call the presence. And he said they experienced this creativity everywhere and in everything. And he went on to note that as a result of their enslavement, their creative, compassionate, and forgiving mindset or soul energy was spread throughout the world. And the invisible hand of evolution would spread this soul energy everywhere on the planet to guide the next step of human evolution. And this soul energy can translate possibilities into new realities. I learned a little something about this, at least thought about this, as I understood how that energy changed a game that I know little about. I mean, I've seen it. I know people go to it, and that's the game of hockey. Who would have thought it? The one thing I remember about going to a hockey game is that I went one time, and I didn't realize that when you go, you need to make sure you bring a coat, because it's cold in there. And I realized you got to go there. It's got to be cold to keep the ice, from melting. Anyway, that's beside the point. The formerly enslaved Africans were responsible for revolutionary, of all things, hockey. I didn't know that. They started with the enslaved people and escaping the South by way of the Underground Railroad. And they ended up going past the border of the United States all the way into Canada, and specifically Nova Scotia. And they were treated pretty well there as human beings, unlike other places in the U.S. And in Nova Scotia, there were local churches that wanted them to be part of their congregation. It was a little self-serving because, they wanted them to get more butts in the seats, something the ministers look at it from time to time. Nevertheless, they wanted them to be there. And now, that in some churches, they used to have these softball leagues. When I grew up, they have some leagues that would go on and have competition between different churches. But in Canada, they didn't have softball leagues. They had hockey leagues. So the black hockey players were formed to attract young black men to Sunday services, and with the promise of a hockey game between the rival churches. And after the service, they would introduce them to this game, and some of the brothers there would say, well, I don't know nothing about that, but they checked it out, And they just saw people sliding on the ice and carrying this curved stick and, hitting this round thing into a net. And they said, well, how hard can this be? They didn't know what they didn't know. But they knew nothing about the rules of hockey. But these gentlemen were creative, and they came up with stuff that people had never seen before. Apparently, all the things that has made hockey exciting today, speed skating, aggressive checking, slap shots, gymnastics of goaltending, were born of necessity from the members of that league and through their creative essence of the soul of these formerly enslaved individuals. I say that to say they used that soul power that traveled through generations to create new possibilities in hockey in Canada. And just like in many musical genres, maybe rock and roll, many of the creative innovations that didn't make it, until they weren't notified or been acknowledged until many years later, who, people like Little Richard, who had come up with a lot of stuff before it became popular. A lot of stuff they did in the hockey league weren't really known until the 1950s. And the black players didn't get credit for all the innovations now taken for granted in hockey. But as one hockey enthusiast said, just like the rest of the world, hockey is better with black people in it. But the whole idea, this invisible hand of evolution that Dr. Thurman talked about, was at work. So when we feed our soul with possibility thinking, when we feed our soul with divine ideas of the Spirit of the living God, we realize that conditions do not have the final word in our life. The content of our soul has the final word. The content of our soul. When the enslaved people were taken from West Africa, they were brought to different parts of the planet. And one of the places they ended up was Brazil. And that was many destinations for many of those enslaved people. And after being transported across the ocean, sometimes only a third of them survived. And when they arrived, they had little or no possessions, and their families were separated. But there was something that was not able to be taken from them, and that was their traditions and their religions. And so the enslaved Africans reorganized themselves based upon their spiritual elements. They called them the gods of the winds and the gods of the forest, the gods of the seas and the waters and the fire. And each of the enslaved related to at least one of those elements. And so when they ended up scattered about on different locations, the enslaved Africans reorganized themselves based upon the spiritual families of the religion of Orisha. And they formed new groups based upon the various aspects of the Orisha religion, such as Ashun, the god of sweet waters, Shango, the god of lightning and thunder, Ogun, the god of iron, and so forth. And so as the enslaved people reorganized themselves in this way, they were no longer lost because they had created a new type of family. And now the enslavers forbade the enslaved Africans from practicing their native religion and forced them to follow the Christian faith. And they instructed them to put the Christian saints on the altar so they could have statues of Jesus there, and on either side they would maybe have the statue of St. Peter there on one side and the Virgin Mary on the other. And when it came for them to start their rituals, the Africans would lay their heads flat on the floor, touching the ground. And when the enslavers and the overseers saw this, they believed that they were paying homage to the Christian saints, and they were absolutely amazed. They were saying, my God, I've never seen such devotion and such faith. We don't even believe as much as they do. But what they didn't know, that under the ground where they had touched their heads, where they put their heads, the Africans had buried pots that represented the symbols of the Orisha gods that they worshipped. So when the enslaved Africans touched their heads on the ground, they weren't worshiping Christianity. They were celebrating their spiritual tradition in a way that they did not understand. And of course, years later, those in power fought to keep the descendants of those enslaved Africans from practicing their native religion. And many people who continued to practice the Orisha religion, even though the government had, burned down their temples and destroyed them, and the police were arresting people who was practicing those religions, the descendants practiced their native religion up until the 1960s, and despite all of the things that were stopping them. And they persevered through the attacks for many, many years. And today there are over 500,000 practitioners and celebrants of the African religion of Orisha today. But the point is this: when our soul is rooted in a divine idea, nothing can stop us. The power that is within us is more potent than the forces outside of us. Many times we have hurdles that may frustrate this power, but nothing can stop it. And as I was singing earlier in the service, I was talking about hip-hop songs, because my son is doing a lot of hip-hop, and I've been listening to a lot of them. There's a song that has a line in it: "Nothing can stop me, I'm all the way up." I don't remember the whole part of the song, but I remember that line. And this soul power is always seeking to be released. The soul expresses its greatest power when it's in tune with the rhythm of the universe. I was talking about the time that one evening I was, many years ago, I can't believe these years of going by, but I took a walk nearby a park. And as I was strolling past the park, there were some kids out there, and they were jump roping. They were doing double Dutch jump roping. It's a lot more difficult than the single jump rope that I would do. And I hadn't seen anybody do double Dutch in a long time, so I decided to sit on a nearby bench and to watch, and one of the kids there knew who I was. They said, "Reverend James, why don't you come and give it a shot?" I said, well, I don't think so. But I didn't want to just act like I didn't want to do it, so I gave it a shot. Of course, I couldn't do it. I got all tangled up in the rope and had no idea what I was doing, as I looked like I didn't know what I was doing. And then one of the kids said, in order to do double Dutch, you have to jump in the middle of the two ropes and get in rhythm with the flow. You got to get in rhythm with the flow. And I did get it down. I didn't get it completely down. But here's the thing, and I think the message: once you get in rhythm with the flow of the ropes, individuals' creativity come into play. Each kid can jump on one foot and jump backwards and use their imagination and all of that good stuff, and not get tangled up in the rope because they're in rhythm with what the rope is. And I think that's how life is. We are here to get in tune with the rhythm of the universe. And when our soul consciousness is in tune with the rhythm of the universe, nothing can deny us. Nothing can stop what is ours by divine appointment. When we begin to get in tune with that, nothing can stop us from getting there. But when we're out of rhythm, and we're out of rhythm either individually or as a collective, we fall short of the divine ideas that Spirit has for us. And we can look around and we see people falling prey in the belief that we're separate from our source. They fall prey to the belief that we're born sinners and there's nothing we can do about it. We may fall prey to the belief that we're not good enough, causing us to get tangled up in the limited beliefs of scarcity and fear and self-inflicted nonsense. That's what sin is, self-inflicted nonsense. I learned that from one of my instructors. That's all it is. We do it to ourselves, including the us versus them consciousness that we often see in our society today. But our mission, should we choose to accept it, is for our soul to get in tune with the divine oneness that is there. And when we begin to do that, we begin back in tune and begin to see stuff from the highest point of view. I'm going to try to, because I got a sign that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try to condense the last part of this. Because when we get in tune, we begin to see from a higher perspective. We have to kind of shift our energy, shift our foot, shift our way of seeing the world differently. And I began to see this in an experience when I had, was seeing my mother, who I said had disappeared. And I had a certain way that I was feeling about this. I didn't know whether I was upset or resentful. And I had a lot of stuff going on. But over the years, I remembered one thing. I remember one day I was in the backyard of our home when I was living in New York. And it was summertime, and I was bored, and didn't know what to do, and I happened to see a beehive in a tree, and I had a stick, and I went over to the beehive, and I decided, I'm just going to hit the beehive. I hit the beehive, and the bees started running after me, and I got away. I'm feeling good about myself. I decided to come back and do it again. And I hit the beehive again, and I got away. And then I decided to go for a third time. But before I went back the third time, the bees decided to have a meeting. So I walked up to the beehive, and I hit and raised my arm. I didn't even hit it. And they came out in formation, Jack. Let me tell you, the Blue Angels had nothing on them. And I got stung on my head and my neck, and I had bumps all over myself. And I remember my mother just taking care of me and loving me and caressing me. And as a result of having that vision, it changed my whole perspective and my relationship to her. And I'll just say briefly, we eventually did get back together like 20-something years later. But I was holding that vision, and something transformed within us. Okay, how much time I got? Okay, keep going. I'm just going to say this last story because I think it's a very important part of it. When I went to Ghana, West Africa, years ago, I went to what they call the slave capital, where the enslaved people were brought before they were put on slave ships to come to the West. And they packed them in boats. And, when we went to that area, there was a tunnel that you walked through. And I can sense that when we went there, all the people of our group, we could feel and sense an energy. And I didn't know how to feel because I was feeling like, I don't know whether to get angry, upset, depressed, sad, all those things going on at one time. I had the range of those emotions. But I talked to one of the chiefs in the community. And he said that, understand that we live in a society, in a world in which there's a continuum of energy. And if we do something positive today, not only are you uplifted, but that energy travels back to others that have come before you. And he says, when you do great things in your life today, your ancestors are freed up because they are feeling and sensing the liberation that you are demonstrating in our life and in our world. And so what we have to do, I believe, as I got from that, to live our lives at the highest and best that we can, knowing that everyone around us will be lifted up in some way, shape, or form. Because there's no past, present, or future. There's only one energy going on. And if we begin to lift up ourselves, everyone is lifted up. Everyone is lifted up. So I'm just going to close out with this. I often wondered, what happens with great people like a Harriet Tubman or a Marcus Garvey or one of my favorite people and my role models, Muhammad Ali, when I grew up? What happens to someone like a Michael Jackson or a Nelson Mandela or a Maya Angelou, who happened to come to Uni on the Bay after one time when we had a service? She came a couple of times, even after I had left, I remember. What happens when they make their transition? What happens to their brilliance? What happens to their soul energy? Does it just disappear? Is it gone? The fact is that people who have overcome so much to be where we are today is proof positive, I believe, that the energy and the power of that soul force, that consciousness, that essence never goes anywhere. It remains as a gift for each and every one of us to remind us of our possibilities and how we can translate those possibilities in our mind, our souls, and the souls of all others to new realities in our world. The world needs us now more than ever to do that, to take that energy in, to transform the communities and society in which we are living right now. And as we do, not only are we lifted up, but we use that soul power to transform the very society in which we live. This is our commission, this is our charge, and why we are here. Let us use that soul power wherever we go. Peace and blessings to you.